3 days ago, my parents stood over my broken body after the car crash and spoke words that destroyed my soul. She's not our real daughter anyway. They abandoned me on that pitch-black highway in rural Ohio, leaving me to burn alive in the wreckage. But I survived, and now I'm watching the evening news report about my own death from this hospital bed while Harold and Margaret Thompson celebrate downstairs in the lobby, already planning how to claim my $2.7 million inheritance. They believe I'm dead. They have no idea I'm alive, conscious, and recording their every conversation. Tonight, they'll discover the letter I left them, and when they read what I know about their murderous secrets, their faces will drain of all color. My name is Sandra Thompson, and until last Friday night, I believed I lived the American dream in Westerville, Ohio. At 28 years old, I worked as a pediatric nurse at Nationwide Children's Hospital, coming home each evening to our pristine colonial house on Maple Ridge Drive. The white picket fence, manicured lawn, and wraparound porch painted a picture of suburban perfection that fooled everyone, including myself. Harold Thompson, the man I called Dad, built his reputation as a pillar of our community through his successful chain of Thompson hardware stores scattered across central Ohio. Every Sunday, he'd wear his navy blazer to St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, shaking hands with neighbors and discussing business ventures over coffee and donuts in Fellowship Hall. Margaret, my supposed mother, volunteered at the local animal shelter and hosted book club meetings in our living room every third Thursday. From the outside, we looked like the ideal American family. Inside our home, subtle tensions always lingered beneath the surface, though I attributed these feelings to normal family dynamics. Margaret would grow silent whenever I mentioned my nursing school achievements, and Harold often seemed uncomfortable during our rare family dinners. I noticed how they exchanged glances when I talked about my patients, as if my compassion somehow irritated them. 6 months ago, everything changed when my grandmother Eleanor Wilson passed away from what doctors called natural causes. Eleanor had been my anchor, the one person who truly understood my dreams of helping children. She lived in a gorgeous Victorian mansion in German Village, surrounded by antique furniture and walls lined with medical textbooks from her late husband's practice as a family physician. Eleanor's death devastated me, but her final gift shocked everyone. She left me her entire estate, the mansion, a portfolio of rental properties throughout Columbus, and investment accounts totaling $2.7 million. Harold and Margaret acted surprised, claiming they had no idea Eleanor planned such a generous inheritance. At the reading of her will, I watched their faces carefully and noticed something strange in their expressions, though I couldn't identify what troubled me. I had beautiful plans for Eleanor's money. Working in pediatric oncology showed me how many families struggled to afford their children's medical care. I wanted to open a children's clinic in German Village, providing free health care to underprivileged kids whose parents couldn't afford insurance premiums or co-payments. Eleanor would have loved that dream. My boyfriend Jake Martinez, a paramedic with Columbus Fire Department, supported my vision completely. We'd been together for 2 years, and he understood my passion for helping others because he felt the same calling. Jake worked the overnight shift at Station 19 downtown, and we'd spend his days off touring potential clinic locations and discussing our future together. My best friend Carolyn Hughes, a social worker with Franklin County Children's Services, always questioned my family relationships. During our weekly coffee dates at North Star Cafe, she'd ask pointed questions about how Harold and Margaret treated me growing up. I'd brush off her concerns, insisting that every family had its quirks and complexities. "Sandra, something doesn't add up," Carolyn would say, stirring sugar into her latte. "Normal parents celebrate their daughters' successes. Yours act like your achievements threaten them somehow." I defended them out of loyalty, but deep down, Carolyn's observations resonated with feelings I'd suppressed for years. Harold and Margaret never attended my nursing school graduation, claiming Harold had an emergency at one of his stores. They missed my 25th birthday party, saying Margaret had come down with a sudden migraine. Small disappointments accumulated over time, creating a pattern I refused to acknowledge. The inheritance changed their behavior dramatically. Suddenly, Harold began asking detailed questions about my financial planning. Margaret started suggesting I invest the money in their hardware business rather than wasting it on charitable endeavors. Their newfound interest in my finances felt invasive and uncomfortable. 2 weeks ago, I overheard a heated telephone conversation between my parents late one evening. I'd stopped by their house to return a casserole dish Margaret had lent me, and I heard Harold's voice through the kitchen window as I approached the back door. "We need to handle this problem before it gets out of hand," Harold said urgently. "She's getting too independent, making plans we can't control." Margaret's voice was equally tense. "Eleanor ruined everything by leaving her all that money. We should have been more careful about their relationship." "Well, it's too late for regrets now," Harold replied. "We'll claim what's rightfully ours, one way or another." I stood frozen on their back porch, confused by their conversation but not quite understanding its implications. When Harold mentioned getting rid of the problem, I assumed they were discussing some business issue with their stores. I never imagined they were planning my murder. Friday evening started innocently enough when Margaret called me at work during my shift change. "Sandra, honey, your father wants to take us to dinner at the cabin tonight," she said sweetly. "Family time is so important, don't you think?" Their cabin in Hocking Hills had been a family retreat for as long as I could remember, though we rarely used it anymore. The last time we'd driven there together was probably 3 years ago for Harold's birthday celebration. Margaret's sudden invitation surprised me, but I agreed, thinking perhaps they wanted to discuss my inheritance plans in a more private setting. I met them at their house around 7 o'clock, still wearing my purple scrubs from the hospital. Harold seemed unusually nervous, checking his watch repeatedly and glancing out the front window as if expecting someone. Margaret kept wringing her hands and making small talk about the weather, which was completely unlike her normally reserved personality. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked Harold as we climbed into his silver Buick Enclave. "You seem agitated about something." "Just tired from a long week at the store," he replied, but his hands trembled as he adjusted the rearview mirror. "Nothing a nice dinner won't fix." We drove south on Route 664 toward Logan, Ohio, the familiar highway stretching through rolling hills and farmland. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, turning around every few minutes to study my face with an expression I couldn't interpret. Her scrutiny made me uncomfortable, and I found myself checking my phone for messages from Jake. 20 minutes into the drive, Harold began acting even stranger. He kept glancing in his mirrors as if worried about being followed, though the road behind us was empty except for an occasional pickup truck or sedan. When I asked if something was wrong, he insisted everything was fine, but his voice carried a sharp edge I'd never heard before. The sun had set completely by the time we reached the winding section of highway that cut through dense woods. Tall oak and maple trees formed a tunnel of darkness on both sides of the road, their branches blocking out the moonlight. This stretch of Route 664 was notorious for accidents because of its sharp curves and lack of streetlights. That's when Harold made his move. Without warning, he jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending our vehicle careening toward a massive oak tree at the roadside. In that split second of terror, I realized this was no accident. Harold was trying to kill all 3 of us, making it look like we'd lost control on the dangerous curve. "Harold, what are you doing?" I screamed, grabbing for the wheel. Margaret turned around with cold, calculating eyes. "It's time, Sandra. Eleanor left you too much money, and we can't let you waste it on your ridiculous charity ideas." I fought Harold for control of the steering wheel, but he was stronger and more determined. The car flipped sideways, rolled twice, and slammed into the oak tree with a sickening crash of metal and shattering glass. The engine caught fire immediately, and I could smell gasoline and burning plastic as I lay trapped upside down in the wreckage. My left arm was bent at an impossible angle, broken in multiple places. Blood poured from a gash across my forehead, and breathing felt like knives stabbing my chest. But I remained conscious enough to hear Harold and Margaret's voices outside the burning vehicle. "The little witch survived," Harold said, his voice filled with disgust rather than concern. "Look at her moving around in there." Margaret's response chilled my blood. "Just leave her, Harold. She's not our real daughter anyway. Let her burn with the car. We'll tell everyone she died on impact." Through my haze of pain and shock, I watched them search through the wreckage for my purse and cell phone. They took everything that could identify me, including my hospital ID badge and the keys to Eleanor's mansion. Then they simply walked away, leaving me to die in the flames. The car's fuel tank was leaking, and I knew I had maybe minutes before the whole vehicle exploded. I tried to move, but my broken ribs made every breath agony. Just as I was losing consciousness, I heard the rumble of a diesel engine approaching on the highway. Bill Crawford, a 70-year-old farmer heading home from his evening chores, saw the flames, and immediately pulled over. This stranger risked his own life crawling into the burning wreckage to pull me free. He dragged me to safety just as the gas tank erupted, sending flames 50 feet into the night sky. "Stay with me, honey," Bill said, pressing his jacket against the worst of my bleeding. "I'm calling 911 right now. You're going to make it." The ambulance ride to Ohio State University Medical Center was a blur of sirens and urgent voices. I drifted in and out of consciousness during the 40-minute trip to Columbus, but I remember hearing one paramedic tell another that I probably wouldn't survive the night. 6 hours of emergency surgery saved my life. Dr. Rachel Brennan, the trauma surgeon who operated on me, later explained that I'd suffered broken ribs, a collapsed lung, severe burns on my arms, and a traumatic brain injury that should have been fatal. Only my youth and physical fitness kept me alive. While I lay in intensive care, supposedly unconscious and fighting for my life, I overheard 2 police officers discussing my case with hospital staff. Detective Sarah Coleman was telling a nurse that my parents had reported me dead at the scene and were already contacting lawyers about my inheritance. "Poor folks," the nurse replied sympathetically. "Losing their daughter so young, and right after she inherited all that money from her grandmother." Detective Coleman nodded grimly. They seemed pretty composed for grieving parents, but everyone handles trauma differently. The father already asked us about death certificates and insurance claims. As I lay there pretending to be unconscious, the horrible truth crystallized in my mind. Harold and Margaret had planned this murder specifically to claim Eleanor's inheritance. They weren't grieving parents at all. They were calculating killers who had tried to eliminate their own daughter for money. For 3 days, I maintained the pretense of being in a coma while doctors, nurses, and visitors discussed my condition around my supposedly unconscious body. This deception gave me crucial information about my parents' activities and allowed me to plan my response to their betrayal. My injuries were severe enough to justify the coma story. The traumatic brain injury had caused significant swelling, and Dr. Brennan explained to Harold and Margaret that I might never wake up. My broken ribs had punctured my left lung, requiring emergency surgery and a chest tube that made breathing painful for weeks. The burns on my arms from the car fire required skin grafts and daily wound care that left me moaning in pain, even while pretending to be unconscious. Dr. Brennan became my first ally purely by accident. While checking my chart on Tuesday morning, she muttered something about my blood type not matching my parents' medical records. "That's odd," she said to herself. "Both parents are type O positive, but Sandra is type A positive. That's genetically impossible, unless..." She stopped herself, but I'd heard enough. Harold and Margaret had told the truth about one thing. I really wasn't their biological daughter. This revelation explained so many childhood memories that had never made sense. I looked nothing like either of them, with my auburn hair and green eyes compared to their dark brown hair and brown eyes. My personality was completely different too, driven by empathy and compassion while they showed calculating coldness. Patricia Wong, my night shift nurse, noticed signs that I was more aware than I appeared. When she checked my vital signs around 2 in the morning, she'd speak softly about her own family and career. One night, she mentioned that she'd been adopted as a baby from Taiwan and understood the complexity of family relationships. "I know you can hear me, Sandra," Patricia whispered during her rounds on Wednesday night. "Your heart rate increases whenever someone mentions your parents. If you're awake, squeeze my hand." I squeezed gently, and Patricia's eyes widened with understanding. "They're not good people, are they?" she asked quietly. When I squeezed again, Patricia made a decision that probably saved my life. "I'm going to help you, honey. Whatever you need." Patricia smuggled my laptop and phone into my room hidden under clean bedsheets. While she stood guard at the door, I researched inheritance laws and discovered several important facts. Since I was legally declared dead, Harold and Margaret couldn't immediately claim Eleanor's money without a death certificate and probate proceedings. However, they were moving quickly to obtain the necessary paperwork. More disturbing was what I found in my online banking accounts. Over the past 6 months, Harold and Margaret had been systematically draining my checking account through small withdrawals that totaled nearly $15,000. They'd also applied for home equity loans against Eleanor's rental properties using forged power of attorney documents. Thursday evening brought Jake to the hospital. The police had told him I'd died in the crash. and he came to say goodbye to my supposedly lifeless body. When he saw me, open my eyes, and motion for silence, Jake nearly collapsed from shock. "Sandra? Oh my God. You're alive," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "They told everyone you were dead. Your parents are planning your funeral for Saturday." I explained everything that had happened, and Jake's expression transformed from joy to rage as he understood the scope of Harold and Margaret's betrayal. As a paramedic, Jake had seen enough family violence to recognize the signs I'd missed for years. "I never trusted them," Jake admitted. "Remember last Christmas when they tried to talk you out of our relationship? They said I wasn't good enough for you, but I think they were afraid I'd protect you from them." Jake proved invaluable in gathering evidence. Using his key to Harold and Margaret's house, he'd helped with yard work the previous summer. Jake installed tiny recording devices in their kitchen and living room. The conversations he captured over the next 2 days provided devastating proof of their crimes. On Friday afternoon, Jake played back recordings of Harold and Margaret discussing their murder plot with chilling casualness. "The crash worked perfectly," Harold said. "No one suspects anything except an accident on a dangerous road." Margaret's voice was equally cold. "I still can't believe Eleanor left her all that money. We raised that girl for 28 years, and she was going to waste millions on some charity clinic." "Well, the problem is solved now," Harold replied. "Once we get the death certificate, we can claim everything as her next of kin. The lawyers said it might take a few weeks, but we'll be millionaires by Christmas." The recordings revealed more horrifying details. Harold and Margaret had been stealing from me for years, using my credit to expand their hardware business and taking out loans in my name. They'd also been listed as my medical power of attorney and life insurance beneficiaries since I turned 18, using documents I'd never signed. Most shocking of all was their discussion about Eleanor's death. Margaret admitted that Eleanor hadn't died from natural causes as the coroner had ruled. They'd been slowly poisoning her with antifreeze mixed into her evening tea, making her death look like kidney failure. Eleanor had threatened to expose their financial abuse of me unless they stopped, so they murdered her first. By Friday evening, I had recordings of their confessions, evidence of their financial crimes, and documentation proving they'd forged legal documents for years. But I still needed to time my revelation perfectly to ensure maximum legal impact. Dr. Brennan agreed to help me fake my continued coma while I recovered and planned my counterattack. She told Harold and Margaret that I was brain dead and recommended removing life support, knowing this would force them to reveal their true intentions about my death. Carolyn visited the hospital Friday night, supposedly to pay her respects to my body. When I opened my eyes and explained the situation, her social worker training helped her understand the psychological abuse I'd endured throughout my childhood. "Sandra, this explains so much about your relationship with them," Carolyn said softly. "You've been walking on eggshells your whole life, trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it." Carolyn helped me document years of emotional manipulation and financial exploitation. Together, we created a timeline of suspicious events that painted a clear picture of Harold and Margaret's long-term plan to eventually murder me for inheritance money. Saturday morning brought the most disturbing revelation yet. While pretending to be unconscious during Harold and Margaret's visit, I learned they'd been planning my death since Eleanor's will was read 6 months ago. Margaret admitted that they'd tried to poison me twice with the same antifreeze method they'd used on Eleanor, but I'd been too busy with work to drink the tea they'd prepared. "The car crash was our backup plan," Harold said coldly. "Much more reliable than poisoning, and it looks completely accidental." As I lay there listening to them discuss my murder with the casual tone of people planning a grocery list, I realized that these people had never loved me at all. I was simply an investment that had finally matured enough to harvest. Sunday morning brought Thomas Mitchell, Eleanor's estate attorney, to my supposed deathbed. Harold and Margaret had convinced him to visit the hospital to discuss transferring my inheritance to them as my closest living relatives. What they didn't know was that Eleanor had built safeguards into my inheritance that required my personal appearance and biometric verification. Patricia arranged for me to speak privately with Mitchell while my parents waited in the hospital cafeteria. When I opened my eyes and explained the situation, this seasoned lawyer immediately understood the implications. "Eleanor suspected something like this might happen," Mitchell told me quietly. "She added special provisions to your inheritance specifically to prevent anyone from claiming it fraudulently. Your parents can't touch that money without your actual presence and fingerprint verification." Mitchell revealed that Eleanor had shared her concerns about Harold and Margaret during our last meeting. She'd noticed their increasing interest in my finances and had worried about my safety. The safeguards she'd built into the inheritance weren't just legal protections, they were shields against the very people who'd raised me. Eleanor left sealed instructions that if anything suspicious happened to you, the entire inheritance would go to children's charities instead of reverting to the family, Mitchell explained. She knew Margaret was dangerous, Sandra. Your grandmother was trying to protect you from beyond the grave. This news gave me tremendous leverage. But I needed concrete evidence of Harold and Margaret's crimes before revealing myself. Mitchell agreed to delay any inheritance proceedings while I gathered the proof necessary to destroy them completely. Jake's recording equipment captured increasingly damaging conversations throughout Sunday and Monday. Harold and Margaret discussed their timeline for claiming my money, their plans to sell Eleanor's properties, and their complete lack of remorse for murdering both Eleanor and me. "I'm almost glad she's dead," Margaret said during Sunday dinner. "That girl was getting too independent, asking too many questions about her adoption." Eleanor filled her head with ridiculous ideas about helping people. Harold's response was equally heartless. "The inheritance is rightfully ours anyway. We fed and housed her for 28 years. This is just compensation for our investment." Dr. Brennan helped me coordinate with Detective Sarah Coleman, who had begun investigating inconsistencies in Harold and Margaret's story about the crash. The detective found it suspicious that two people could walk away from an accident that supposedly killed their daughter instantly. "Car crashes don't usually result in such different outcomes for passengers," Detective Coleman told Dr. Brennan. "Either everyone dies or everyone survives. Having two uninjured people and one fatality suggests something else happened." Monday afternoon, Jake discovered that Harold and Margaret had increased my life insurance policy to $500,000 just 3 months earlier. Insurance investigator David Park was already suspicious about the timing and had begun looking into their financial situation. "Policy increases right before suspicious deaths are major red flags," Park told Jake confidentially. "We see this pattern in murder cases involving family members." That evening, I spent hours crafting the letter I would leave for Harold and Margaret. This wasn't just a confession of what I knew about their crimes. It was a psychological weapon designed to destroy them completely. The letter contained photocopies of all their recorded conversations, documentation of their financial fraud, and evidence of Eleanor's murder. But the most devastating revelation was saved for last. The truth about Margaret's relationship to Eleanor and my real parentage. Through Mitchell's investigation and Eleanor's private papers, I'd learned that Margaret was Eleanor's daughter, not Harold's mother-in-law, as everyone believed. Margaret had gotten pregnant at 17 and given me up for adoption to hide her shame from Harold and his family. Eleanor had arranged for Harold and Margaret to adopt me, keeping the secret to protect Margaret's reputation. Margaret had murdered her own mother and tried to murder her own biological daughter for money that was rightfully mine by birth. This truth would destroy her psychologically and legally, proving premeditation and eliminating any possibility of claiming self-defense or temporary insanity. Tuesday morning brought news that Harold and Margaret had successfully obtained a preliminary death certificate and were scheduled to meet with Mitchell that afternoon to begin transferring my inheritance. They'd also made appointments with insurance companies and had hired a realtor to appraise Eleanor's properties. Dr. Brennan helped me plan my resurrection for maximum impact. We would wait until Harold and Margaret arrived at the hospital to sign final paperwork. Then I would appear with police officers present to witness their reactions and arrest them immediately. Patricia helped me practice walking and talking normally so my physical condition wouldn't undermine the dramatic impact of my survival. The brain injury had affected my balance and coordination, but adrenaline and determination would carry me through the confrontation. Jake positioned himself in the hospital parking garage to film Harold and Margaret's arrival and capture their initial reactions on video. This footage would provide additional evidence of their guilt when they showed no joy at discovering I was alive. Tuesday evening, everything was in place. The letter lay on my hospital bed where Harold and Margaret would find it when they came to complete their inheritance claim. Hidden cameras were recording their every move, and police officers were stationed throughout the hospital waiting for my signal. I spent that final night reviewing 28 years of memories and realizing how many warning signs I'd ignored. Harold and Margaret had never really loved me. They'd simply been waiting for the right moment to cash in on their long-term investment. But Eleanor had loved me, and her love would give me the strength to expose their evil and reclaim my life. Wednesday morning arrived with crystalline clarity as I watched live social media streams of my own memorial service from my hospital bed. Jake had set up his phone to broadcast the ceremony at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, and the contrast between genuine grief and calculated performance was heartbreaking. My co-workers from Nationwide Children's Hospital filled 3 entire pews, many of them sobbing openly as they remembered our shared experiences caring for sick children. Dr. Amanda Foster, my supervising physician, delivered a eulogy about my dedication to pediatric nursing that brought tears to my eyes. These people genuinely mourned my loss. Harold and Margaret, meanwhile, played their roles with Oscar-worthy performances. Margaret dabbed her eyes with tissues while accepting condolences from neighbors, but I could see her checking her watch impatiently. Harold shook hands with community leaders and nodded gravely as people shared memories of my childhood, but his attention was clearly elsewhere. The most disgusting moment came during the reception in Fellowship Hall. While mourners shared stories about my compassion and generosity, I watched Harold discreetly exchange business cards with real estate agents who'd approached him about Eleanor's properties. Margaret cornered Mitchell in the church parking lot, pressing him about inheritance timelines and asking pointed questions about probate procedures. "These people are grieving her death, and you're already planning how to spend her money," Carolyn said, confronting Margaret near the dessert table. The live stream captured Margaret's moment of calculated composure as she responded. "Sandra would want us to be practical, dear," Margaret replied smoothly. "Grief doesn't pay bills or maintain properties. We have to think about the future." That afternoon, Mitchell informed me that Harold and Margaret had successfully obtained an official death certificate from the Franklin County Coroner's Office. They'd provided fraudulent witness statements claiming they'd checked my pulse at the crash scene and confirmed my death before emergency responders arrived. The death certificate opened all the legal doors they needed. Harold and Margaret had scheduled meetings with insurance companies for Thursday morning and had made appointments with 3 different real estate agents to begin selling Eleanor's properties. They were moving fast to liquidate everything before anyone could question their claims. "They're being remarkably efficient for grieving parents," Mitchell observed dryly. "Most people can barely function for weeks after losing a child. These 2 are conducting business like seasoned professionals." That evening, Patricia helped me practice the physical movements I'd need for my confrontation with Harold and Margaret. The brain injury had affected my balance and fine motor skills, but my determination to expose their crimes gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. Jake arrived with devastating news from his insurance investigator contact. David Park had discovered that Harold and Margaret had attempted to increase my life insurance policy to $1 million just 6 weeks ago, but the insurance company had rejected the application as excessive for someone my age and profession. They settled for $500,000. "But the timing is incredibly suspicious," Park had told Jake. "Normal people don't think about life insurance increases unless something's wrong. This suggests premeditation going back months." More damning evidence came from Dr. Benjamin Clark, Eleanor's former physician, who contacted Detective Coleman with concerns about Eleanor's death. Dr. Clark had always found it strange that Eleanor's kidney failure progressed so rapidly in her final weeks, especially since her previous tests had shown normal function. "I wanted to request an autopsy at the time, but the family insisted on immediate burial for religious reasons," Dr. Clark explained to the detective. Looking back, several symptoms were consistent with antifreeze poisoning rather than natural kidney failure. Wednesday night, I finalized every detail of my letter to Harold and Margaret. The document was structured like a legal brief, presenting evidence in order of severity and building toward the devastating revelation about Margaret's true relationship to Eleanor and me. The letter began with their recorded confessions about planning my murder and Eleanor's death. Next came documentation of their systematic financial fraud and identity theft. Then I presented evidence of their insurance fraud and forged legal documents. The final section revealed the truth about Margaret being Eleanor's daughter and my biological mother. I included photocopies of adoption records that Eleanor had hidden in her personal papers, along with DNA test results that Mitchell had expedited through his legal connections. "You murdered your own mother and tried to murder your own daughter for money that belonged to your child by right of birth?" I wrote. "Eleanor knew what you were, Margaret. That's why she left everything to me instead of you. She was protecting her granddaughter from her own daughter's evil." The letter concluded with instructions for Harold and Margaret to confess their crimes to authorities or face prosecution with overwhelming evidence. I gave them 24 hours to surrender themselves before I would reveal my survival and present everything to the district attorney. Thursday morning brought the final phase of my plan into motion. Harold and Margaret arrived at the hospital at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying briefcases full of legal documents and wearing expressions of barely concealed excitement rather than grief. They'd brought Mitchell with them to complete the inheritance transfer, along with a notary public to witness document signatures. Insurance investigator Park was also scheduled to meet with them about my life insurance claim. What they found instead was my letter lying on the hospital bed where my body should have been. As they read through page after page of evidence, I watched through hidden cameras as their faces transformed from confusion to horror to absolute terror. Harold's hands began trembling so violently, he could barely hold the papers. Margaret went completely white when she reached the section about Eleanor being her mother and me being her daughter. "This is impossible," Margaret whispered, her voice cracking with panic. "Sandra is dead. We saw her die in that car. She couldn't have written this." Harold was hyperventilating as he read the transcripts of their recorded conversations. Someone was listening to us. Someone recorded everything we said about Eleanor and about the crash. The most devastating moment came when Margaret realized that I knew the complete truth about our biological relationship. She collapsed into a chair, understanding that her deepest secret was exposed and that she'd attempted to murder her own child for money. "Eleanor knew," Margaret said in a broken voice. "That's why she left everything to Sandra. She knew I gave her away, and she knew what we were planning." As they sat in my empty hospital room reading evidence of their crimes, Harold and Margaret had no idea that I was watching from the hallway, surrounded by police officers and preparing for the confrontation that would destroy them forever. At exactly 11:30 Thursday morning, I stepped into my hospital room doorway supported by Jake on one side and Dr. Brennan on the other. Detective Sarah Coleman and 2 uniformed police officers flanked us, creating an imposing presence that filled the entire entrance. Harold's reaction was immediate and devastating. When he saw me standing there alive and conscious, his face went completely gray and he collapsed backward into the visitor's chair, clutching his chest as if having a heart attack. The briefcase full of inheritance documents scattered across the floor, spilling fraudulent papers everywhere. Margaret's response was even more dramatic. She screamed, "No!" so loudly that nurses came running from down the hallway, then began hyperventilating so severely that Dr. Brennan had to check her pulse. "You're dead!" Margaret shrieked, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "I watched you burn in that car. This is impossible." "Hello, Mother," I said quietly, emphasizing the word that made Margaret's eyes widen with absolute terror. "Surprised to see your daughter alive after you tried to murder me for my inheritance?" Detective Coleman stepped forward with arrest warrants already prepared. "Harold and Margaret Thompson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, elder abuse resulting in death, and multiple counts of identity theft." The recording devices Jake had planted captured Harold's immediate confession as panic overtook his ability to think clearly. "We never meant for this to happen," he babbled to the detective. "Margaret said it would look like an accident. She said no one would ever know." Margaret's breakdown was complete and devastating. 28 years of lies and manipulation crumbled as she faced the daughter she'd tried to kill. "Eleanor threatened to tell you the truth about being my daughter," Margaret sobbed. "She said she'd expose everything unless we stopped taking your money. So you murdered your own mother," I stated calmly, "and then tried to murder your own daughter." The insurance investigator David Park arrived just in time to witness Margaret's confession about Eleanor's death. "We used antifreeze in her evening tea," Margaret admitted through tears. "Just small amounts over several weeks so it would look like kidney failure. Eleanor was going to ruin everything." Harold tried to claim diminished capacity, insisting that Margaret had manipulated him into participating in the murder plots. "I didn't know Sandra was Margaret's biological daughter," he pleaded with Detective Coleman. "Margaret told me Eleanor was senile and making false accusations about us." But Jake's recordings proved Harold's full knowledge and participation. The detective played back conversations where Harold discussed specific details of both murders and showed no remorse for my supposed death. "The little brat was going to waste millions on some stupid charity clinic," Harold's recorded voice filled the hospital room. "We deserved that money after raising her for 28 years. District Attorney Catherine Walsh arrived with additional charges based on the evidence I'd provided. Eleanor's exhumation had been ordered that morning, and toxicology tests would confirm the antifreeze poisoning that Margaret had just confessed to using. The financial crimes were equally devastating. Harold and Margaret had stolen over $43,000 from my accounts, forged my signature on loan applications totaling $200,000, and committed insurance fraud by increasing my life insurance policy while planning my murder. This represents one of the most calculated and systematic family murder plots we've ever prosecuted, District Attorney Walsh announced. The evidence of premeditation is overwhelming. Mitchell presented documentation proving that Eleanor had suspected Harold and Margaret's criminal intentions for months before her death. She'd revised her will specifically to protect me and had left sealed instructions for authorities to investigate if anything suspicious happened to me. Eleanor Wilson was trying to save her granddaughter's life from beyond the grave, Mitchell explained. Her legal safeguards prevented these defendants from claiming the inheritance and provided evidence of their motives for murder. The hospital room scene concluded with Harold and Margaret being led away in handcuffs while media crews captured their arrest for the evening news. Margaret was still sobbing and confessing details of both murders to anyone who would listen, while Harold maintained shocked silence as the scope of their crimes became public. Dr. Brennan examined me one final time before my discharge, marveling at my physical and emotional recovery. "Sandra, your survival is nothing short of miraculous," she said warmly. "Most people wouldn't have had the strength to endure what you've been through, much less orchestrate such a complex plan for justice." As I walked out of Ohio State University Medical Center that Thursday afternoon, I felt the weight of 28 years of lies and manipulation finally lifting from my shoulders. Harold and Margaret's arrest was just the beginning of my journey toward healing and justice, but seeing them in handcuffs gave me strength I never knew I possessed. The local news crews wanted interviews, but I declined to speak publicly until after their trial. There would be time for telling my story later. For now, I needed to focus on rebuilding my life and honoring Eleanor's memory by turning her inheritance into something beautiful. Jake drove me to Eleanor's Victorian mansion in German Village, where I would finally live free from the people who'd pretended to love me while planning my death. The house felt different now that I knew the truth about Eleanor being my grandmother and Margaret being my biological mother. Every room held new meaning when viewed through the lens of family history rather than childhood memories. Eleanor hadn't just been a kind, elderly woman who'd loved me. She'd been my grandmother trying to protect me from her own daughter's evil. That evening, Carolyn brought dinner to the mansion and helped me process the emotional complexity of discovering my true parentage through such traumatic circumstances. "You've been through something that would break most people," she said gently. "Finding out your parents tried to murder you is devastating enough without learning they weren't really your parents at all. But I felt stronger than broken. Harold and Margaret's arrest had given me closure and validation that my childhood feelings of disconnection weren't imagined. I'd never truly belonged with them because I wasn't meant to. Eleanor had been my real family all along. 6 months later, I stood before a packed courtroom in downtown Columbus, ready to testify against Harold and Margaret Thompson in the trial that had captivated Central Ohio. The media called it the inheritance murder plot, and prosecutors described it as one of the most calculated family betrayals in Franklin County history. Harold received life in prison without possibility of parole for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and the death of Eleanor Wilson. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours before finding him guilty on all charges. When the verdict was read, Harold showed no emotion, staring straight ahead as if he couldn't comprehend how his perfect plan had failed so completely. Margaret's trial was even more dramatic because of her biological relationship to both victims. She received 25 years to life for murdering Eleanor, and 25 years to life for attempting to murder me, with sentences to run consecutively, rather than concurrently. The judge called her crimes a betrayal of the most fundamental bonds of family and human decency. During my victim impact statement, I looked directly at Margaret as I described the psychological damage of growing up with a mother who was planning my death. "You gave birth to me, gave me a way to hide your shame, then spent 28 years pretending to love me while stealing my money and planning my murder," I said clearly. "But your evil doesn't define me. Eleanor's love does." Margaret sobbed throughout my testimony, finally understanding the full scope of what she'd destroyed. Her defense attorney had argued for leniency based on mental illness, but psychiatric evaluations revealed antisocial personality disorder rather than any condition that would excuse her actions. The financial restitution was substantial. Harold and Margaret's hardware store chain was seized and liquidated to pay damages, generating $1.8 million that was added to my inheritance. Their personal assets, including their house in Westerville, were sold to cover legal fees and additional restitution. My inheritance ultimately grew to $4.2 million after recovering all stolen money and receiving the proceeds from Harold and Margaret's asset seizures. The life insurance company paid out their policies to me as the beneficiary, since their deaths were ruled justifiable homicide in self-defense of their intended victim. The money gave me freedom to honor Eleanor's memory in ways she would have treasured. I used $2 million to establish the Eleanor Wilson Children's Medical Center in German Village, just 3 blocks from her Victorian mansion. The clinic provides free health care to underprivileged children whose families cannot afford insurance premiums or medical bills. Dr. Rachel Brennan agreed to serve as medical director of the clinic, bringing her trauma surgery expertise to pediatric care. Patricia Wong left Ohio State University Medical Center to become our head nurse, and several of my former colleagues from Nationwide Children's Hospital joined our staff. The clinic opened 1 year after Harold and Margaret's conviction, providing comprehensive medical care including routine checkups, vaccinations, emergency treatment, and specialized care for children with chronic conditions. We also offer mental health counseling for children who've experienced trauma, understanding that healing involves both physical and emotional recovery. Jake and I were married in Eleanor's garden behind the Victorian mansion, with Carolyn serving as my maid of honor and Bill Crawford, the farmer who saved my life, walking me down the aisle. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by people who'd supported me through the darkest period of my life. The psychological healing took longer than the physical recovery. I worked with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a trauma therapist who specialized in family violence, to process the complex emotions of learning that my entire childhood had been built on lies and murder plots. Understanding that Harold and Margaret had never loved me was actually liberating, because it meant their rejection wasn't about my worth as a person. Through DNA testing and private investigator assistance, I connected with Eleanor's sister's family in San Diego. My great-aunt Rose Wilson Martinez welcomed me with open arms, along with my cousins who shared Eleanor's passion for education and community service. Discovering my real extended family provided the sense of belonging I'd searched for throughout my life. Rose shared stories about Eleanor's youth and her heartbreak over Margaret's troubled personality. Eleanor never stopped hoping that Margaret would change, Rose told me during my first visit to California. But she knew Margaret was dangerous, especially when money was involved. Learning about my family history helped me understand that Eleanor's strength and compassion were genetic traits I'd inherited along with her money. The drive to help others and protect vulnerable children came naturally because it was part of my biological heritage. 2 years after Harold and Margaret's conviction, I visited them in prison to deliver a final message. Harold was serving his sentence at Marion Correctional Institution, where he'd aged dramatically and showed signs of severe depression. When I told him that his hardware stores had been converted into a foundation funding child protection services, he broke down completely. Every day you remain in prison, your former businesses are helping protect children from people exactly like you, I told him calmly. Eleanor's money is saving lives instead of enriching murderers. Margaret was incarcerated at Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, where she'd become a model prisoner who spent her days in the library reading about psychology and child development. She apologized tearfully for her crimes and begged for forgiveness that I wasn't ready to give. I understand now why Eleanor left everything to you, Margaret said through the prison glass. You're everything I should have been but could never become. You're her true legacy. I left that prison visit feeling complete closure about my relationship with Margaret. She would spend the rest of her life paying for her crimes, but I would spend mine creating something beautiful from the ashes of her destruction. 3 years after the trial, the Eleanor Wilson Children's Medical Center had treated over 2,000 children and established satellite clinics in 2 other Ohio communities. We'd prevented countless medical emergencies through early intervention and provided hope to families who'd given up on getting quality health care for their children. The clinic's success attracted national attention from pediatric medical organizations and child advocacy groups. Dr. Brennan and I were invited to speak at conferences about combining trauma-informed care with community-based medical services. Our model was being replicated in other states by physicians who shared our vision of accessible health care for all children. My personal life flourished alongside my professional mission. Jake and I bought a small farm outside Columbus where we're raising horses and planning to start our own family. The idea of becoming a mother myself initially terrified me because of Margaret's example. But therapy helped me understand that love and nurturing are choices rather than genetic inevitabilities. The greatest lesson I learned from this nightmare was that blood doesn't make family, but love, loyalty, and shared values do. Eleanor showed me what real family love looks like through her protection and generosity. Jake, Carolyn, Dr. Brennan, and Patricia became my chosen family through their support and friendship. Harold and Margaret taught me what evil looks like when it hides behind the facade of normal family life. But their failure to destroy me ultimately made me stronger and more determined to protect other children from similar predators. Every child we treat at the Eleanor Wilson Children's Medical Center receives the nurturing care and unconditional support I never got growing up. We're breaking the cycle of abuse by showing vulnerable families what healthy relationships look like and providing resources to escape dangerous situations. The inheritance that Harold and Margaret killed for became a force for healing rather than destruction. Eleanor's love continues to grow and multiply through every life we save at the clinic, proving that good ultimately triumphs over evil when people have the courage to fight back. I think about Eleanor every day as I work with sick children and their families. Her legacy isn't the money she left me, but the strength and compassion she modeled throughout her life. Those traits sustained me through my darkest hours and continue to guide my mission of healing and justice. The letter I left for Harold and Margaret changed everything by exposing their crimes and revealing the truth about our family relationships. But the real transformation came from choosing to use Eleanor's gifts to create something beautiful rather than allowing Harold and Margaret's evil to define my future. Today, I'm exactly where Eleanor hoped I'd be, using my resources to help children and creating the loving family relationships that were denied to me growing up. Harold and Margaret's plan to murder me for money ultimately gave me the strength and motivation to build something they could never destroy. Have you ever discovered that the people closest to you were hiding dangerous secrets that completely changed your understanding of your life? Share your story in the comments below, and let's support each other through the process of healing and moving forward. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of survival and justice, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Thank you for joining me on this journey of transformation and for believing that even in our darkest moments, we have the power to create light. Remember that you're stronger than you know, and your story of overcoming adversity could be exactly what someone else needs to hear. Stay safe, stay strong, and never give up on the possibility of finding your real family among people who choose to love you unconditionally.